Well, James Dorsey is a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He joins us now live from Singapore. James, protesters say the withdrawal of the extradition bill is too little too late, and these protests would, I guess, prove that. How do you see this playing out?
Well, it probably won't have a good end. I think the problem is that you now have a standoff in which the Hong Kong authorities and the Chinese authorities obviously are not yet willing to step in and try and really crush these protests. And the longer these protests last, the greater a victory it is for the protesters, and the more emboldened they, of course, will be.
You don't see this taking the same path as the yellow vest protests? I mean, those went on for many, many months. Do you see that as an option here, or is this... explain to me the differences in this scenario.
Well, I think the major difference, of course, is that France is a democracy, and that, therefore, there is much more accountability in terms of the way the government responds and the way law enforcement responds. None of that is applicable to China, and increasingly it is less applicable to Hong Kong.
What would it take, do you think, for China to move in militarily to try and quell these protests?
The question is whether ultimately China has a choice or not. What is clearly the case is that China hoped that the Hong Kong authorities could deal with it. That has proven not to be the case. They had also hoped that the more militant, more violent segment of the protesters would drive a wedge between those who may support the protesters but will back away because of the violence. That hasn't happened either, which really leaves certainly the authorities in Beijing with very few options left.
Where do you think the public support lies then? Is it still with the protesters despite the violence that we've seen, or do you think it's starting to wane?
Well, one can only look at it in terms of anecdotal evidence, but the anecdotal evidence shows that the protests still enjoy wide support, and that ultimately the violence or the push for the airport, for example, has not weakened public support for the protesters' demands.
We'll have to leave it there for time, I'm afraid, James. That's James Dorsey there, a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Thank you.